Look, eventually we're going to default. I mean, it's inevitable. When interest rates go up, we're not going to have any choice. But right now we have a choice. Interest rates are still at zero. The Fed is doing quantitative easing. The government collects every month more than 10 times the cost of paying interest on the debt that they're threatening to default on. Now, the president is talking about the fact that default will be economic Armageddon. The dollar will crash, bonds will crash, interest rates will skyrocket. It's going to be worse than the Lehman Brothers bankruptcy. It's going to be worse than the Great Depression. It's going to be complete economic, pandemonium. Well, let's assume that all that would happen. Why would he choose to default? Because remember, if your income is 10 times your debt service and you don't pay the interest, it's because you chose not to pay it. Not because you didn't have the money, but because you didn't want to do it. So why would the government choose to default? Well, because if the government did pay interest to the bondholders, well, then they would have to cut other government spending. They might have to cut back spending on the military. They might have to cut back spending on Social Security, on Medicare, on Obamacare, on government pensions. But the president doesn't want to cut anything. So the president is basically saying, as bad as default is, that's what I'm going to choose, because I'd rather have the country go through that than have to cut any other government spending. That's what he's saying. But what he's also telling our bondholders is, hey, you're not going to get your money back. Because if there's ever a problem, if we ever run short on funds, you guys are the first to go. That the bondholders are junior to everybody else, that we're going to pay everybody first, and only if there's money left over, we're going to pay the bondholders. That's really what we're saying. Based on that, Moody's and Standard & Poor's and Fitch should immediately lower the rating on U.S. Treasuries to junk bond status. After all, we've just admitted that we're going to default. I mean, imagine if, General Motors, well, maybe that's a bad example. Let's say IBM said, if you got IBM bonds, we might not pay you if we decide that we have other better uses for the money. Only if we just don't have any better uses will we give you the interest on the bonds. And if the courts would back that up, of course, you have no recourse. If the U.S. government decides not to pay, you can't sue them. So the U.S. government can just default whenever it wants. At least see if IBM defaults, the bondholders can sue. They can go to court and they can force IBM to pay. But if the U.S. government defaults, you're SOL. There's nothing you could do. So if the U.S. government is saying we might default, in fact, if we can't borrow more money, we will default, and you have no recourse, you can't sue them, how can the bonds possibly be rated anything other than junk? Well, the reason is because if you downgrade the U.S., you're going to get sued. See, S&P found that out the hard way. So that's the reason they can say whatever they want, because it doesn't matter. They're always going to have their investment grade. But why are they faking default? Why are they doing this? Because they want to pretend that if they don't raise the debt ceiling, it's going to be a collapse. See, it's all part of this whole maximize the pain to the public, so they think that they need all of this government. Look, what did they just do over the weekend? They passed a bill that says that all the government furloughed workers are going to get 100% of their back pay. Why are they doing that? I mean, so now the one benefit of the shutdown is we don't have to pay the salaries of all the people who aren't working. But now we've lost that as taxpayers. Now we have to suffer the inconvenience of not having any of these government workers on the job, but we still have to pay for all the workers who are now on a paid vacation. So now all the government workers are rooting for the shutdown to continue, because the longer it continues, the longer their paid vacation is going to be. If I was a senator, I would have voted against this. This is a giveaway. This is pandering to buy the votes of the government workers by giving them a free vacation. Now, here's something that I might have voted for. In fact, I probably would have proposed it myself as an alternative, but nobody thought about that. How about this? How about pass a law that says if any government workers want to show up and do their job, even though they're not getting paid, when the shutdown is over, then they can get their back pay. See, why not do that? Because then the taxpayers would get the benefit of the work they're paying for. But they don't want to do that. because the president has ordered the administration to maximize the pain for voters so that they'll be upset about the shutdown. See, that's a better solution. Let them work and then get paid later. Even maybe they could have paid it with vouchers, a transferable voucher that maybe so you can use it to pay your rent because your landlord can then take it and cash it in when the shutdown is over. There were all sorts of things they could have done that would have kept the government workers on the job, but they have to maximize the pain. You know, a perfect example of this is what happened in South Florida, where the government is trying to shut down the ocean. 1,100 square miles of ocean. The Florida tourism is a big part of the industry. A lot of people come to Florida and they want to go fishing. And the government said that these commercial fishing boats that take individuals out fishing, they can't now go out in the water and fish because the government boats or the workers that normally would patrol the waters, I don't know, maybe to keep everybody safe, that these government patrol boats are not going to be there because of the shutdown. And so, therefore, nobody is allowed to fish, as if these boats are even necessary to fishing. In fact, I read some articles where the fishermen said, I've never even seen one of these boats that are supposedly out there. But apparently they're there. So the government says nobody can fish. And to make sure that nobody fishes, they're going to assign all sorts of government personnel to man boats to patrol this 1,100 square miles of ocean to make sure that nobody is fishing. In other words, it's going to cost taxpayers a lot more money to shut the ocean down than to keep it open. See, apparently, the personnel who patrolled the oceans for our safety, they're not necessary. They're not emergency. But the personnel that are now being assigned to police the oceans to make sure that nobody fishes, well, they're absolutely necessary. I mean, this is completely unreal. Again, how can the media let them get away with this? They lie with impunity. We're going to default if we don't raise the debt ceiling. Raising the debt ceiling doesn't add to the debt. It's not going to cost us one dime. And basically doing stuff like, shutting down open air monuments where, if the government spends more money to shut these things down than to leave them open. And this is supposedly a shutdown. Meanwhile, all of these government workers are on a paid vacation. Give me a break.